They say there are some decisions a parent can make that change history inside their own house. But in 1849, on a quiet plantation in Georgia, one decision didn't just change a family. It destroyed everyone connected to it. The neighbors would later whisper that the screams never reached the fields, that the silence was the worst part, because when cruelty happens in silence, it grows. Before we go further, if stories that uncover dark chapters of forgotten history pull you in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Night Archive. It helps this channel grow, and it makes sure you don't miss the next story that history tried to bury. Now let me take you back. The plantation sat miles away from the nearest town. Tall oak trees surrounded the property like silent witnesses. From a distance, it looked peaceful. Large white house, wide wooden porch, long rows of cotton stretching toward the horizon. But peace can be an illusion. The owner of that plantation was a man named Harold Whitmore. He was known for being strict, cold, and obsessed with appearances. In public, he carried himself like a respectable businessman. At church, he spoke softly and donated generously. At home, he ruled with control. His wife had passed years earlier, leaving behind their only daughter, Eleanor. Eleanor Whitmore was not what her father wanted her to be. She was soft-spoken, withdrawn, and heavier than what society at the time considered acceptable. Harold saw her not as a daughter, but as a reflection of his reputation. And in his mind, she was a flaw that needed to be corrected. In those days, a young woman's value in elite Southern society was measured by marriage prospects. Beauty, grace, obedience. Eleanor struggled with all three. She spent most of her time inside the house, reading by the window or walking quietly along the edge of the property where the trees began. She avoided guests, avoided town gatherings, avoided the judgment in her father's eyes. But there was one place she found some peace. Near the far end of the fields worked a man named Samuel. Samuel had been brought to the plantation years earlier. He was known among the workers as intelligent, careful, and calm under pressure. He rarely spoke unless necessary, but when he did, people listened. Eleanor had once seen him help an injured worker after a farming accident. The care in his voice surprised her. It was the first time she saw kindness on that property. Over time, their interactions were small, brief, a nod, a quiet exchange of words about the weather. Nothing more. But in a house filled with coldness, even small kindness feels powerful. Harold began to notice, not because there was anything improper, but because he noticed everything. He saw Eleanor walking further than usual. He saw her pause near the field. He saw Samuel glance up when she passed. And in Harold's mind, this was not connection. It was disrespect. One evening, after a failed dinner meeting where a potential suitor rejected Eleanor, Harold snapped. He blamed her appearance, her demeanor, her weakness. He told her she was an embarrassment, that no respectable man would marry her, that she was ruining the Whitmore name. Eleanor did not argue. She never did. But that night, something shifted inside Harold. He became obsessed with fixing her, not out of love, out of pride. What happened next would change everything. Harold called Samuel to the main house the following afternoon. That alone was unusual. Workers did not enter the house unless ordered. Samuel stood in the study, hat in hand, eyes lowered. Harold paced slowly. He told Samuel that Eleanor lacked discipline, that she needed structure, labor, physical correction through work. He then made a decision that would shock even the overseer. He ordered Eleanor to begin working in the fields, publicly, in front of everyone. It wasn't about health. It was humiliation. The message was clear. If she could not be a proper lady, she would be treated as labor. The next morning, Eleanor stepped into the sunlight wearing a plain cotton dress, hands trembling. The workers watched in silence. Samuel felt something twist in his chest. Harold stood on the porch, observing like a judge. The work was brutal for someone untrained. The heat was unforgiving. By midday, Eleanor's hands were blistered. By evening, her shoulders burned. But what Harold did not expect was that she didn't break. Day after day, she returned to the fields. Samuel quietly made sure she wasn't assigned the heaviest loads. He adjusted tasks when possible. He offered small advice in low whispers. Pace your breathing, shift your grip, drink water slowly. There was no romance, only survival. Weeks passed. Eleanor grew stronger, thinner, not dramatically, but enough for Harold to notice. But instead of pride, he felt threatened, because strength meant independence, and independence meant loss of control. Then something happened that Harold could not tolerate. One afternoon, Eleanor laughed, not loudly, but genuinely. It was the first time in years. Samuel had made a quiet comment about how the oak trees seemed to lean closer during storms, as if they were listening. It was harmless, but Harold saw it from the porch. That night, he called Samuel back to the study. The conversation was shorter this time, colder. Harold accused him of overstepping, of filling Eleanor's head with ideas, of creating confidence where obedience should be. Samuel did not defend himself. He simply said, "She deserves dignity." That sentence sealed his fate. Within days, Samuel was reassigned to the harshest labor on the property. Longer hours, minimal rest, isolation. The other workers understood what it meant. Punishment without public acknowledgement. Eleanor noticed immediately. When she asked her father about it, Harold's response was chilling. Know your place. But Eleanor was no longer the silent girl who only endured. Something had changed in those fields. She had discovered resilience. And now she saw cruelty clearly. The house grew tense. Meals were eaten in silence. Storm clouds rolled in one evening, dark and heavy. That night would be remembered by the workers for years, because something happened that no one could fully explain. And by morning, nothing on the plantation would ever be the same. The storm started just after midnight. At first, it was distant thunder, low and rolling across the land like a warning. Then the rain came, heavy, relentless, soaking the fields within minutes. The oak trees bent under the wind, their branches scraping against the sky. Inside the big house, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The sound of the storm felt different that night, closer, personal, like the earth itself was restless. She sat up in bed and looked out the window. In the distance, she could barely see the edge of the fields when lightning split the darkness for a second. And in that flash, she saw something. Movement, not in the fields, near the barn. Her heart tightened. Samuel had been reassigned there earlier that week. The barn repairs had been declared urgent, which meant long hours, often alone. Another crack of lightning. This time she saw two shadows. Then the lights went out in the barn. Completely. The next morning, the plantation was quieter than usual. Too quiet. The workers gathered slowly, whispering in low tones. The overseer avoided eye contact. Harold remained inside longer than usual. Samuel was not present. Eleanor asked one of the workers what happened. The man only shook his head slightly and said, "Storm was rough last night." But the look in his eyes told her that wasn't the full truth. She went to her father directly. "Where is Samuel?" Harold didn't look up from his desk. "He's been transferred." "Transferred where?" "That is not your concern." Her stomach dropped. Transferred was a word plantation owners used when they didn't want to explain things. It could mean sold. It could mean worse. For the first time in her life, Eleanor did not lower her voice. "What did you do?" The question hung in the room like a blade. Harold slowly looked up at her. I reminded him of his position. Her chest felt tight. "You punished him because he spoke kindly to me." "I punished him," Harold said calmly, "because he forgot the structure of this household." There it was. Structure. Control. Power. Eleanor realized something in that moment. Her father was not trying to protect reputation. He was protecting authority. And authority that fears kindness is already weak. That evening, she walked alone to the barn. The ground was still wet from the storm. Mud clung to her shoes. The sky was heavy and gray. Inside, she saw signs of struggle. Not dramatic, but clear. A broken lantern. A rope cut loose. Deep scratches in the wood near the back wall. Her breathing became uneven. Samuel had not simply been transferred. He had resisted something. And then he had disappeared. Word spread quietly among the workers over the next few days. Samuel had been sent away before sunrise. No announcement. No formal sale records shown publicly. Gone. But here is what Harold did not anticipate. Removing Samuel did not restore control. It exposed fear. Eleanor stopped speaking to her father entirely. She no longer asked for permission to walk the grounds. She no longer attempted to fit into his expectations. Instead, she did something far more dangerous. She listened. She began spending time near the worker quarters, not as a superior, but as an observer. She watched how they lived, how they survived, how they protected one another in silence. She learned things her father never wanted her to understand. That dignity cannot be assigned by rank. That strength is not measured by weight. That fear is the tool of insecure men. Harold noticed the shift immediately. His daughter was no longer ashamed. She was aware, and awareness spreads. Within weeks, small changes began happening across the plantation. Workers moved with less visible fear. They shared glances of quiet confidence. The overseer reported subtle disobedience. Nothing dramatic, just slower compliance. Quiet refusal of humiliation. Harold responded the only way he knew how. He tightened control. Longer hours, stricter supervision, public reprimands. But fear works differently once people see through it. And Eleanor had seen through it. Then came the night that sealed Harold Whitmore's legacy forever. It wasn't another storm. It was calm. Too calm. A warm southern night, crickets humming in the dark. Harold woke to the smell of smoke. At first he thought it was a dream. Then he heard shouting. Real shouting. He rushed to the window. The far end of the fields was burning. Not the house. Not the main crops. But the storage barn. The same barn where Samuel had last been seen. Flames rose high, orange against the black sky. Workers ran toward it with buckets, forming lines. Eleanor stood near the edge of the porch, watching. Not panicking, not screaming, just watching. Harold ran outside, demanding answers. Who did this? No one responded. The fire was contained before it reached the main crops. Damage was limited, but the message was clear. Control had cracked. The next morning, several workers were gone, not captured, not reported missing, simply gone, escaped. Harold's reputation began to crumble. Other plantation owners heard whispers. Buyers grew cautious. There was talk of investigation, talk of unrest. Eleanor confronted her father one final time. You thought humiliation would make you powerful. He said nothing. You thought removing one man would remove dignity. Silence again. You were wrong. Harold looked older that morning than he ever had before. Because for the first time, he understood something terrifying. Power built on fear collapses when fear fades. Within a year, the plantation was sold at a loss. Harold Whitmore left Georgia quietly. No grand farewell. No public acknowledgement of failure. Eleanor never married into Southern society as he once intended. Instead, she used what inheritance remained to move north. Years later, records show she funded education programs for formerly enslaved families. Not publicly, not for praise, but because she understood what dignity costs when taken away. And as for Samuel, there are no official records of where he went. Some say he reached freedom. Some say he didn't survive the transfer. But here's what we do know. The barn that burned that night was never rebuilt. Locals avoided that land for decades. They said it felt heavy, as if the air itself remembered. And maybe it did, because cruelty leaves marks long after the people are gone. At Night Archiev, we tell these stories not for shock, but for understanding. History is not just dates and battles, it's choices. And sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not with violence, but with someone refusing to accept humiliation. If this story made you think, tell me in the comments what moment stood out most to you. Do you think Harold believed he was justified? Or did he always know he was afraid? Share this story with someone who believes power equals strength. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Night Archiev so you never miss the next story that history tried to silence. Because sometimes the quietest stories leave the deepest scars. End.